From the St. Francis Yacht Club in San Francisco, this is the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, hosted by Ron Young.
Welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, live from the virtual grill room of the St. Francis Yacht Club. It's a beautiful day here in virtual land, and we hope that you are sheltering in place in a comfortable and safe environment. And we look forward to greeting you back in the Yacht Club just as soon as this pandemic is over. Our guest today was born in Chicago, and he got his BA in government from Pomona College. And then he would zoom off to Washington, D.C., where he spent 7 years as a congressional staffer, for the first half as a House staffer, and then as a Senate staffer. Then he would come back to California and serve in Governor Pete Wilson's cabinet, and then go off to Chicago again, where he would get an MBA at Kellogg. After that, he came back to California, joined Pete Wilson again, this time as the director of the California Department of Conservation. He also served as a commissioner for BCDC during that time, and then he would become the executive director of the PG&E Foundation, and then serve another term as a commissioner of BCDC. And in 2012, was named as executive director of the BCDC. So Larry Goldzband, executive director of BCDC, welcome to the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.
Thank you very much. Wish I could be there in person. So I want to thank you very much for the invitation. It's always really delightful to talk to people about San Francisco Bay for any number of reasons. With regard to where I am today, literally standing in my kitchen 10 miles or so from the Bay, it just makes me feel like I should be somewhere else. And I'm very jealous of all of you because you spend so much time on the Bay, and certainly more than I actually do. But I want to talk today about how the Bay is changing. I'll start with some history, but I really want to talk about how the Bay is changing and how we deal with it. And that's because of climate change. So when I talk to folks who are on the Bay a lot, they recognize that the Bay changes, from minute to minute. And we're really here talking about year to year, decade to decade, and the like. So let's start. BCDC was created in 1965, and it was the first ever organization to be created as an actual coastal zone management agency. That is, an agency specifically directed to deal with managing and leading the development and conservation of a coastal area. And that's because the three ladies who created Save San Francisco Bay, who were faculty wives at UC Berkeley, recognized that they could only do so much without active state intervention. If you take a look at the screen, you'll see how the Bay looked in 1849 and then how it looked in 1965. And you can see that a great deal had already been filled in, totally indiscriminately by local governments and private industry. And actually, the federal government commissioned a study to say, how could the Bay be filled in even more for housing and development? And you can see that it saw that as of last year, 2020, literally 60 years or so in the future from when the commission studied it, not BCDC, but another commission, that the Bay would turn into basically a nice little river that ended in Palo Alto. Well, the ladies were going to have none of that. So BCDC was established to protect a shrinking Bay. And this is the kind of indiscriminate filling that happened daily along the Bay shoreline until 1965. And this was taken pretty much right around Candlestick Point, but it could have been anywhere along the Bay. But in 1969, BCDC became permanent. You can see there Governor Reagan signing the bill with a number of legislators, including Nick Petras and Jack Knox, and the three ladies from Berkeley who created Save San Francisco Bay, because they ensured that the state legislature would actually complete the job and make BCDC permanent and give BCDC both permitting authority and voluntary planning authority for the entirety of San Francisco Bay, basically up to Pittsburgh and Antioch area, and also within 100 feet of mean high tide. And that's an important thing to remember. That's the jurisdiction. The bay, basically from the Golden Gate to Pittsburgh, Antioch, and within 100 feet landward of mean high tide. But now we don't have a shrinking bay. Indeed, the bay has increased in size since BCDC was created. Instead, we have a growing bay. And this is just a map that we created about what could actually be wet in 2100. And you can see that the blue area, which is now dry land, at least for most of the time, would be underwater in 2100 under a certain set of conditions. As a result, what happened actually at BCDC was rather incredible. Our previous executive director, Will Travis, a tremendous resource for the Bay Area and the nation, basically figured out during the first decade of the 2000s that BCDC needed to change the way it worked. And so it worked through the commission and the like to develop a climate change policy in 2011, which was tremendously difficult and actually tremendously controversial. And what it did from a regulatory standpoint is make sure that if you're going to build in or around the bay, you had to use scientific evidence and figure out how the bay would actually affect your development given climate change and rising sea level. You had to have a resilience plan through 2050, and you had to be able to adapt to 2100. And the numbers you had to use were the numbers that have been generated by the state of California for its prediction of rising sea level. So for example, if the state of California figured that rising sea level would happen by say 12 inches by 2050, your development had to already, before it was actually even put into the ground, be able to withstand 12 inches at least of rising sea level and the like. So BCDC adopted the climate change policies in 2011 and made them part of the Bay Plan, which is the regulatory framework that we use. And then the same year, in the planning side of BCDC, created the Adapting to Rising Tides program, commonly known as ART. Now we're not talking about public art on the bay. We're talking about the Adapting to Rising Tides program. And what that did was create a voluntary way to look at small and large scales of bay shoreline and figure out how local governments can work together in order to ensure resilience along the bay at various places. And a few years later, 4 years later or so, BCDC, with help from our NOAA friends, people in Washington, D.C., the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, created the Policies for a Rising Bay report. And that's an incredibly important report because what it did was it transferred an awful lot of knowledge, not only scientific knowledge, but also social knowledge, especially in the area of environmental justice, to the way BCDC views rising sea level. And then in late 2016, BCDC adopted a series of policy actions that would ensure that from going forward, we would deal with rising sea level in very systematic, constructive ways. The Adapting to Rising Tides program in the late part of the past decade really expanded in terms of voluntary cooperation among local governments and the private sector and nonprofit organizations. I can talk about that a little bit later. And that has now morphed into an even larger group of stakeholders trying to figure out how to do an actual regional adaptation strategy for rising sea level. The ART Bay Area program and the EJ policies, the environmental justice policies and the PHIL policies are really, really important for those of us who do policy and for those of you who actually see the Bay. And during that time, what you see is that we weren't acting alone. We all voted on Measure AA, which increased property taxes by $12 a year in order to pay for various types of wetland restoration around the Bay. The state of California published various types of rising sea level guidance. There was a competition called Resilient by Design to try to see who could come up with the most creative but workable solutions for large portions of the bay. For those of you who sail right along the Embarcadero, you will see at some point in the next few years a lot of construction beginning as San Francisco needs to replace its seawall. And then, of course, all this has to be taken into account as the Plan Bay Area, which is the regional government way to look at how people should actually develop the Bay Area in order to reduce the effects of greenhouse gases and the like on climate change. All that has to be taken into consideration by Plan Bay Area. So as my late grandmother would say, it's a big mishmash. But what you really want to do is try to figure out how each of our agencies works together to ensure that we have integration. Let me take a second for Measure AA, because many of you, I'm sure, voted for it. When it was approved a few years ago, it was really groundbreaking, because never before had the entire Bay Area voted on something, with the exception of a couple transportation measures. But all 9 counties voted for it. Indeed, it received a majority in each of the 9 counties. And the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority, which takes those monies, it now grants them out. And it improves millions of dollars every year in grants for wetland restoration. And that's really, really important, because as you sail around the bay, you see that there are all sorts of different types of restoration that are possible. But it's not just planning, it's also regulation. And I know sometimes people think that's a bad word, but regulatory work isn't necessarily bad. I mean, it simply means that we need to build things according to various standards. And one of the things that we've done as an experiment in order to reduce the time it takes to actually get a permit when you're building in and around the bay is to work cooperatively with our brethren at Fish and Wildlife, the Water Board, and so on, to actually do the permits instead of ad seriatim, to actually do them together so that we can get them done more quickly. And it's called the BRIT, the Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team. And I'm always happy to accept a better acronym if you can find one. Essentially, what we're trying to do is integrate each of the regulatory functions of each of these 7 different regulatory agencies without losing any authority, but making sure that people who want to develop, whether it's wetlands or whatever, but certainly starting with wetlands, don't have to run the gauntlet from, of 7 different agencies, here, there, and so on, and take 7 or 8 years to do it. So we're starting to do that, and it's actually working. But let me talk about these 2 amendments. I love these 2 pictures. They were taken just a few hours apart, and you can see how the bay changes, and you see that because you are, you're on the bay all the time. The key here is what we need to do in order to help protect people and habitat and property from rising sea level is to enable wetlands to actually expand. To do that, we need to change our laws. We need to change the way we think. We were created to stop fill. We need now to make sure that we allow more fill in the bay, specifically for wetlands. And so what we did was we meaning the commission, it's the commissioners who vote, not the staff. The commissioners accepted our recommendation and the recommendation from a broad swath of people, whether they be governmental people or nonprofits or whatever. And they basically said, you have to change the way you look at fill. You have to allow more fill in the bay. And so we did that for specific purposes. And so we now allow more fill of dredge sediment and the like to create more wetlands. At some point, the 3 ladies may have been rolling over in their grave, right? Because my gosh, this is so antithetical to BCDC, but it was incredibly important. The second major amendment we did in 2019, just a couple weeks later, was to really move forward the idea of environmental justice and social equity. For so long, the at-risk communities around the bay, and there are so many of them, from East Palo Alto down to Alviso, around up toward Oakland, out to Richmond, the Bayview Hunters Point area, and the like have been the last people ever to be consulted about what goes on in their neighborhoods and what goes on along the shoreline around their neighborhoods. And so we changed the way we expect and will force local governments and developers to respect at-risk communities and to ensure that there is meaningful collaboration among developers and at-risk communities so that what is being developed actually doesn't displace them necessarily, but actually goes forward and helps their community. And the real here, and it all goes back to the fact that ecosystems as well as people are on the front line. And we have the highest vulnerability of habitats at risk in the from sea level in California. This is my favorite slide. And it's my favorite slide because I can see where my wife works at Intel. And thankfully, she's on the second, third, or fourth floor in whatever building she's in when she gets back there, for heaven's sake. So she won't get wet right away. But you can see how rising sea level under certain circumstances is going to get Yahoo, Facebook, Intel, Citibank, the whole group wet. And that's another reason, not just habitat, but people and places we need to protect. So the Adapting to Rising Tides program basically has developed ways for people, local governments, nonprofit organizations, and so on, to figure out how to develop their vulnerability assessments, how to do adaptation planning, how to identify what the best data is to use. We actually have a help desk, so anybody can call or email, and we always help local governments. And what we also do is identify what the new challenges are. So let me go into that a little bit. Just recently, actually about 10 months ago, BCDC published a small 750-page document called the Adapting to Rising Tides Bay Area program or project, and it was actually funded by Caltrans and MTC. And the reason they funded it is because they see the threat to their infrastructure. Caltrans is no dummy. They see that the water is coming up to their highways and coming up to their bridges. BART sees it, Muni sees it. So the transportation agencies have gotten together and really started working on rising sea level. And so in every PowerPoint presentation, you have to have a slide that nobody can possibly read to demonstrate that you're actually doing something that's important. Well, this is my slide. And what we do in ART is we basically take a look at systems, and then we take a look at the scales of those systems and figure out how to work at the different scales, regional, local, and really, really local. And the systems we use for the ART program are transportation, highways, seaports, don't forget about airports, the Bay Trail that many of you walk around, for heaven's sake, vulnerable communities, those at-risk communities in and around inside the shoreline that are really at risk. Priority development areas, that is where Plan Bay Area thinks that we should be building as a community. And then priority conservation areas, places we need to protect. So you put that big simus, a mess in Yiddish, you put that big simus into the meat grinder and you go like this, and you come up with an awful lot of data which demonstrates what we're facing and what we need to deal with. So for example, if the bay were to rise by 36 inches at some point, and it will, and candidly under the guidance by the state of California, they're figuring that may very well happen by the year 2100. This is what gets wet if you're a transportation asset. You can't really look at it, but you can see that the eastern part of the Bay Bridge in Oakland is all red. You can certainly look at the area around Highway 37 in the North Bay. I mean, Highway 101 in Sausalito and that area, heck, that floods now, right? So you can see these various places around the bay that get wet. What happens when you also add priority conservation areas? These are areas where there is specialized habitat for endangered species and the like. Well, look, a lot of that is in sort of the same kind of place. Isn't that interesting? Throw in priority development areas, the areas that you're supposed to, according to Plan Bay Area, want to develop new housing in. Well, it looks like some of that's in the same place. Now look at vulnerable communities, and they're all over the place. So what we do is we take a look at these systems, we look at the scales, and then we develop clusters. Here are the hot spots, as we call them, at 36 inches. East Palo Alto, Redwood City, Alameda, Bayview, downtown Oakland, City of Richmond, Martinez, Suisun City. And you can always put Highway 37 in the North Bay in a hotspot, just because we've all seen it flood anyway. So that's at 36 inches. That's at the end of the century, give or take, certainly, according to the state of California. What happens at 108 inches? You can see that it's even bigger. So that's the kind of information that we share with local governments and various stakeholders and help them figure out how to become resilient, both at small scale and at large scale. And there are a lot of planning issues that come out of this. I mean, the fact is that if a part of transportation floods in one place, it affects everything else. So for example, if you can't get across the Bay Bridge, what are you going to do? Well, you're going to take the Golden Gate if you have to go to Marin County, or you could take the Richmond-San Rafael Bridge if you have to go somewhere else, or you take the San Mateo Bridge. Traffic gets clogged all over because transportation's a network. And if you clamp down in one place, you're going to feel the effects everywhere else. When you take a look at who makes decisions, it's complicated because different types of organizations and different people own different things around the Bay. You have 46 cities that touch the Bay, 9 counties that touch the Bay, hundreds of special districts, and private ownership. And it's all interconnected. And so therefore, all those functions are at risk. And therefore, that exacerbates the flooding risk. And so you have to figure out, if you're going to actually develop in the future, where you develop in the future. And then you have to figure out how you develop based upon the friction between recreation and habitat, for example. So there are an awful lot of issues, as you might imagine. So where do we go from here? The big issue, be proactive. Don't react, start planning now. Solve these crises together. As I've told our staff and I've told our commission, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can regulate and plan at the same time. We just have to be smart about how we do it. We have to do it regionally, and that's the big deal. So therefore, we've moved from the ART program to Bay Adapt. And let me just talk about Bay Adapt for a second. Bay Adapt is a large-scale, 150, 200-person stakeholder voluntary discussion group, which is coming out with a series of probably 12 to 20 priority actions that local governments and the private sector and nonprofit organizations need to take collaboratively to make sure that we actually can develop a regional adaptation plan. And that's going to happen this year. We've been working on it for about 6 to 7 months, and it's hard getting everybody together. But I will tell you, and I'll tell this to Ron, who of course is running this through Zoom, that sometimes Zoom can be really helpful because we can get people in a virtual room a whole lot easier than we can get people in a physical room. But it does make it more difficult to actually create consensus and to get decisions done. So let me finish off by talking about 2 things that I think may be really applicable to you all at the Yacht Club. First of all, the regulatory program that BCDC has includes an enforcement component. It hasn't been very well funded. It hasn't been very well, it hasn't been strategic in the past. And when I applied to be executive director, having been a former commissioner, one of my 4 goals was to actually create an enforcement program, which we have started to do. Some of you may recall that the California State Auditor released an audit about 1.5 years ago, criticizing BCDC's enforcement program. This is one of these marvelous times where recommendations can be really helpful to you, and that's what we said publicly. Even though we didn't like the language in the report because we thought it was overwrought, we did like most of the recommendations, and we've actually implemented most of them over the past 1.5 years, which is pretty short time. And the Department of Finance of the state of California recognizes that and has helped us actually create some positions, for example, an enforcement attorney and an enforcement manager, neither of which we had before, which helps us. One of the big enforcement issues that we are dealing with now deals with Richardson Bay. and many of you know, all of you know, because you've sailed in Richardson Bay, that there are well over 100 to 150 illegally anchored boats in Richardson Bay, many of which, if not most of which, are not at all seaworthy. And it is against the law to live on the bay. BCDC was created so that shopping centers aren't in the bay, floating football stadiums aren't in the bay, big high rises and office buildings aren't in the bay, because the bay is for the bay. If you can build it on land, you shouldn't build it in the bay. And housing is the same way. And so we are working with the Richardson Bay Regional Agency to, over the next number of years, clean up Richardson Bay and actually make it more environmentally friendly, because candidly, the anchor outs have, and the continuing anchor outs have hurt the environmental standards in Richardson Bay. And the second thing I want to talk about is that every 5 years as a coastal zone agency, we work with NOAA to agree on what the next 5-year plan really needs to be. It's not a strategic plan necessarily, but it's, if you had the money, what would you do? And one of the things that the commission agreed on late last year when it approved this plan that NOAA also just approved, was to try to figure out whether we could get the funding to update the Bay plan on recreational policies. Because we think, and we've heard from boaters and stakeholders who represent boaters, that recreational boating has changed dramatically over the past 20 to 40 years. And the question is, how do marinas operate now? How should they operate? What should BCDC do with regard to marinas? And, you know, it used to be when I grew up in San Diego, you know, you had friends who had boats in marinas, right? In yacht clubs, Southwestern, San Diego, Kona Kai, wherever. And you'd go there and you'd go out and have a great day and they'd come back. Well, we understand that's very different now for a large segment of the population. So we want to see if we can actually get the funds in order to figure out how we should actually create and amend current Bay policies to account for the differences in recreational boating. So with that, I am more than happy to turn it back over to Ron. And of course, I'm more than happy to answer any questions. And for those of you who want to write down how to get hold of me, I mean, you can go to BCDC's website and we're right on there under staff. I certainly will answer emails and phone calls. So Ron, back to you.
Great. Thanks for this quick overview of the BCDC. So give us some information about it. What's the corporate structure? Is this a 501c3? What is it?
BCDC is a state agency, which means we get our funding from Sacramento and the like. And it was created, and I probably should have said this, but I think some people know and some people don't. It was created in 1965 as a state agency with a regional jurisdiction. And so what they said was, we need to have a county supervisor from each of the 9 counties on BCDC. We need to have 4 local city council members, Northeast, South, and West, on BCDC, 5 gubernatorial commissioners, representative from the state assembly and state senator, and you know, 7 or 8 different federal and state agencies that deal with the Bay. So we have 27 commissioners, and usually about 21 or 22 show up for each meeting. We meet twice a month. And the great thing about BCDC, and what makes it very different than the Coastal Commission, which came along 10 or 12 years later, is that we have a real well-defined geographic scope. And people in the Bay Area really understand that they're part of the Bay Area. And I mean that very, very specifically. We don't live in the Ridge area. We don't live in the Valley area. We live in the Bay Area. The Bay is the center of the area. And so as a result, when you come to BCDC as a commissioner, as I did, without knowing a lot about the Bay, you learn very quickly that you take off your local hat, wherever you live, and you put on your Bay region hat. And you decide things based upon what's best for the region as opposed to what's best for the place that you live in that region.
So what's the annual budget?
About $9 or $10 million. We have 50 to 55 staff members, and most of the money candidly goes to salaries and rent. Our offices are down on Beale Street in San Francisco at the new MTC building. We have a little part of that on the 5th floor. We're renters. And we get about 2/3 of our money from the general fund of the state of California. We get, I don't know, 10, 15% of the funds from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, cap and trade. So the more gas you spend, the more money there is, the more gas you buy, the more money there is in GGRF. And then we actually have contracts and grants to work with other folks like NOAA, like local governments and the like on various projects. And that helps pay for the planning folks as well.
How do you measure success of BCDC?
Well, the easy way to measure success historically has been the size of the bay and access to the bay. Well, the bay's grown, so we know that we're doing our job because the bay has grown. We know that access is far easier now than it was in 1965 or even the year 1990. You have 400 miles or so of bay trail around the bay. You know, back in 1965, the bay was everybody's backyard. It wasn't everybody's front yard. Nobody wanted to be near the bay because it stank and it looked, it looked horrible. I mean, it wasn't anything you really wanted to be proud of. But Save San Francisco Bay Association and BCDC over the years, along with the Regional Water Quality Board and the like, have really improved the way the bay looks and the way the bay feels and the environmental qualities of the bay and access to the bay. I mean, you can get to the bay from almost anywhere now around the Bay Area, and you couldn't do that before. And so it was easy to measure for success. Now it's actually harder, because what we need to deal with rising sea level is how do you actually measure resilience? And that's something we're going to be talking a lot about over the next few years as we promote resilience on a regional scale, local scale, and the like. How do we actually measure our success in that?
So what's the historic record on the rising sea level? In other words, do we have a number for what it was at 1900 and 1950 and 2000? What are the numbers?
We do. We do. And it's really sort of interesting. The tidal gauge, the Golden Gate, is, I've heard it both ways, either the oldest or second oldest active tidal gate or tidal gauge in the United States. And we have seen over the past century or so that the bay has risen 8 inches or so.
From when? From when to when?
During the 20th century.
From 1900 to 2000, you're saying?
Give or take.
Okay.
And what you can do is you can actually go onto the NOAA website, because it's a NOAA tidal gauge, and you can dig down a little deeply into the website. And I did this actually with somebody from Mill Valley right before Christmas who had the question. And you can actually see month by month for X number of years how the tides have changed. And so what's happening now is that the state of California under Governor Schwarzenegger started a scientific process by hiring an awful lot of really good scientists, or contracting with an awful lot of great scientists in California, to figure out how the state of California looks at rising sea level in the future. When will what happen? That's the big question. And so as a result, the guidance that we use from the state of California is what's called probabilistic guidance. And we basically say, 12 inches by 2030, maybe, a foot and a half by 2050, maybe 3 feet by 2100. But if hell goes into the handbasket, it could be as much as 10 feet. I mean, in the real small slice probabilistic scenario, if, ice sheets start melting in a big way and the like. So you have to figure out as a regulator what the needs are of the development that you're dealing with, and how that then plays within the guidance.
So when a Save the Bay initiative happened in the 60s, and the 3 ladies, Sylvia and Catherine and Esther, all of whom have passed along, and they were incredibly gallant ladies. I started sailing in the Bay in the late 50s, 57. And so they were very, very well regarded, well known, and in fact, very successful. In those days, you're right, the bay was dirtier, and there used to be a measurement of bay quality and cleanliness. It used to be called in the 60s, it was called the Striped Bass Index. And I remember sometime around the 80s, somebody reported to me that the Striped Bass Index was now 6, and originally been 100 in like 68. So it had dropped like in 15 years from 100 fish caught in X period of time to like 6. So that was a kind of an early measure. What are the current measures for bay cleanliness that you look at?
Well, we actually, just to make a distinction here, the people you really need to talk to about the actual chemistry of the bay
Yes.
were created back in the 70s, and it's the Regional Water Quality Control Board.
I know, but you
Because-
must have some measure of that too. Do you pay attention at all to the cleanliness? I agree that they're a different entity and I'm familiar with them. They've actually been guests on a show. But I want to know that you, as a BCDC, do you also pay attention to the cleanliness of it? That's kind of what the real question is. Or do you
We actually pay attention to it maybe in a little different way, because we take a look at the biology. For example, we know, for example, that in Richardson Bay, one of the real detriments to having all these boats out there just drop anchor and float around for however long is that it's definitely hurt the eelgrass. I mean, a lot of the eelgrass has really been decimated. And the Audubon Society had a scientist do a major study, and it just basically demonstrates that. Well, eelgrass is a huge, huge important habitat for different types of species in the bay. And as a result, one of the things we are very concerned about, and one of the reasons we need to end the illegal anchor outs, is to get Richardson Bay and the eelgrass back to where it should be. So we're very concerned about that habitat. Another example is that most people have no clue where concrete comes from. I mean, why would you, right? Well, you need sand to build concrete. Where do you get sand? Well, you can get sand from the bay. And so there is active sand dredging in the bay, in the central portion of the bay, up towards Sassoon and the like. And in 2025, the commission will have to decide, when the existing permits run out, how that should actually happen. So we're working with a group of scientists, along with the sand mining industry, to look at the different biological effects of sand mining. And for the most part, or we think, but we don't know, they're subtidal, meaning you got these little organisms that are really important to the ecosystem that actually live underneath, right? And if you're dredging, how does that actually affect it? So those are the kinds of markers that we use as a commission to actually look at the health of the bay.
So from the St. Francis Yacht Club on the marina, if you look toward Alcatraz and you look at the southwestern corner of Alcatraz,
Right.
just a little bit to the left of that direct line, you'd see dredge spoils get dropped there frequently. Many of us inside the club who see this happen and have seen this happen for decades wonder, oh my goodness, they're dropping it on a flood tide, meaning the dredge spoils are going back into the bay. Now, we've had NOAA people come and talk. We've had Army Corps of Engineer people come and talk. We have baykeeper people come and talk. And all of them say, we dropped the spoils there because it used to be a deep hole there, and we've been filling up that deep hole. When asked by the people who do it, they say, we don't go out the gate and drop those dredge spoils out in the ocean, where it would be spread over a broader area and not be as likely to go back into the estuaries of San Francisco Bay, because it costs more money to take your dredge barge all the way out to, halfway to the Farallones or far out that way. Now, that's an issue that relates to, sort of like, it's not really bay fill, but it sort of is bay fill.
Well, it is bay fill.
Line? Yeah, so where's the line? Are you involved in those kind of decisions?
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Okay, so talk to us about that, because we might have some common oxus to gore here, since we in the yachting community don't believe in a dirty bay, and we think these dredge spoils are not great things to be dropping back into the bay. Just for our audience, people who get dredge spoils, they get them from going into harbors, making those harbors deeper by sucking up dirt and soil from the bottom of the harbor and putting it into a big barge. And then what do they do with those spoils? They could take them out the gate, but frequently they drop them inside the bay. So I've spoken long enough. Love to hear from you on this.
This is a really, really complex and important subject, because the thing that we have to do for rising sea level is create and restore as many wetlands as we can, because in the near and medium term, they will act as a sponge as the bay rises. And in storms, they attenuate wave action. So as a result, marshes are really important. We at BCDC never use the term dredge spoils, Ron.
Okay.
Because that makes dredging look like it's just dirty mud that should be thrown somewhere else.
Right. You love that, but you love those, what we call spoils. What do you call them?
Materials. Why
Great.
not? It's an
Yeah,
M.
yeah, yeah.
Right? I mean, what does it matter? I could call it Fred for all I care.
New coastal materials.
The key that we want is we don't want them taken out to Dodds, which is the acronym for the place 60 miles out. And candidly, I'd rather have them not dumped around the bay indiscriminately. I'd rather have them shipped from wherever they're being dredged along as long as it's clean stuff, and most of it's pretty clean, to sites around the bay, especially in the southern portion of the bay where wetlands are being recreated, and the northern portion of the bay where wetlands are being created, and dump there specifically to increase the viability of those restoration efforts. Unfortunately, it costs a heck of a lot more money to transport those, according to the Corps of Engineers, to transport those, and pretty much anybody else, I should say, I'm not going to pick on the Corps here, to transport those dredge materials within the bay to specific places, offloaded in a specific way, etc., than it does to shove them out 60 miles out, or even to put them around Alcatraz or somewhere in Central Bay. It just costs more money. And it makes sense because you're not only just transporting, but you're also having people have to deal with moving the materials in certain ways at certain times in certain places. So what we try to do with the Corps is encourage the heck out of them, along with other dredgers, to include in pricing and figure out how to price a better way, moving those dredge materials south and north to Eden Landing or to the South Bay salt ponds, or up north. The Coastal Conservancy has done Hamilton. They're now in the midst of starting Belmarin Keys. Those marvelous wetland restoration projects need dirt, and we want that dirt to go there. And we actually, in the spirit of transparency, sued the Corps of Engineers a number of years ago because we think that they're actually operating illegally in terms of how they actually price things. And we lost in federal court, but we've appealed. So we'll see how that works. I mean, we have a good relationship with the Corps. I mean, we didn't want to sue them. We just don't think that they're actually doing things from a real good policy basis. And we've actively worked with our legislators to try to change the way the Corps actually works.
So now, all of us who are on the bay all the time are noticing that wakes, we have dear friends with beautiful powerboats. We've all been guests of beautiful powerboats. They're wonderful. And yet they do have a wake. And of course, as you may know, our guest in a couple of weeks will be the president of a Swedish company that's created a new electric foiling speedboat, a 25-foot speedboat, Candela. So that speedboat, which is foiling, has minimal wake to literally almost no wake. I've seen it in the water and on the land in its trailer. And those kind of foiling boats have minimal wakes and thus don't do damage to the shorelines that they sail next to. We know that it's called the Bay Area because the bay is a central geographic feature, and it's also the kind of unifying bond of all the 50+ cities around the Bay Area. And we know that we spend lots of time creating smog with cars, trucks, and transportation devices, but foiling ferries from Vallejo and foiling ferries from the South Bay, all over the Bay Area, could basically use the bay as a transportation hub that it naturally could be, and actually naturally is. But it should be, but they would be foiling ferries so they don't do damage to the wetlands they get next to, and they also don't hurt the bay as much. They're actually better for the bay than displacing. For those who don't know the difference, a displacement boat that weighs 100,000 pounds has to move 100,000 pounds of water out of the way in order to move through the water. A planing hull moves less than that, maybe 50% of that out of the way. And a foiling boat of any given size flies on top of the water and displaces very, very little water. It's also faster because it's less resistant. So give us your perspective on the future of, let's say, foiling ferries and foiling craft of all sorts.
You know, it's interesting because the WETA, the Water Emergency Transportation Agency, which does a lot of the planning for the ferry system around the throughout the bay and the burgeoning water taxi program, has come to us with the same question, and we say we love the idea. You just need to make sure that you have to prove it. You just have to prove it because we're regulators. You got to prove it. But it has great promise for two reasons. The first is the reason you talk about, which is that we think that the bay is underutilized with regard to transportation of people. And it will definitely help the more you can actually move people around on the bay. No doubt about that. The second thing is that the bay, here I'm going to ask you a question, Ron. I'm going to turn it back to you. You don't have to answer. But what do you think the average depth of is San Francisco Bay?
Well, you mean the Central Bay, or do you mean all the way up to
average depth of the whole bathtub?
Okay, so just give me the dimensions. You're talking about from Milpitas to Antioch?
Talking about San Jose to Antioch. You got it.
San Jose to Antioch. Okay, San Jose to Antioch, the average depth is going to be really low. It's going to be something like 3 or 4 feet, I'm going to guess.
Actually 12. It's actually
12 feet. Because San Pablo Bay is real shallow. Yeah. Okay.
Central Bay is really, really deep, right?
Yeah.
So the bay is actually this really big bathtub, right? Because we're surrounded by hills and the water flows in. And one of the real issues is that where you need to have many of these ferries is even shallower than 12 feet. So if you head down the peninsula, for example, towards San Jose, and you want to put you want to put a ferry landing so that people in Silicon Valley can get to and from by ferry, for example, you're talking about something that is really difficult to do because it's incredibly shallow. So as a result, that new type of ferry, which operates that far above the water or however far it does, I think poses really, really great promise. And we've been in contact with those folks and say, look, just show it to us. Let's figure out how to do it. Now, there is a problem that you need to know. And the problem isn't necessarily because of BCDC, it's because of the way people work. One of the challenges, if not the biggest challenges to ferry transportation, aren't the ferries themselves. It's how you get to the ferry from your house or apartment and how you get to work from the ferry landing. It's what transportation analysts call the last mile problem.
Right.
And that needs to be dealt with by MTC and all the transportation and the local planners and the like, and the transportation systems. Now, you've seen a lot of the private sector, large companies do their own thing, right? I mean, we've all seen the Google buses and all that kind of stuff. And maybe that's what ultimately might happen. But so it's both a water challenge in terms of where you locate an actual ferry landing.
Right.
And it's also a land challenge in terms of moving people either to the ferry or from the ferry.
Last mile, first mile, right. So where do you fit in the matrix of nonprofits in the Bay Area? You mentioned your BCDC. By the way, for those who don't know, please define the acronym, Bay Conservation Development Commission or whatever.
Right. And my predecessor always used to say, and he said he stole it from somebody else, the most important word in Bay Conservation and Development Commission is and. And that sets us apart from the Coastal Commission. The Coastal Commission was developed a decade later to protect the coast, thank God, but trying to get a coastal development permit is fundamentally different than trying to get a permit from BCDC to develop. And that and is what we do. I mean, billions and hundreds of billions of dollars of stuff has been built around the bay since BCDC was created. I mean, it's not just, a Burlingame, office park, or,
Foster City. Remember Foster City?
Yeah.
The people who don't know, Foster City was created totally out of Bayfield in San Mateo. People shoved dirt into the water. The bay that we used to sell water rights in San Francisco 150 years ago. All of Mission Bay, that entire development was a bay where in fact San Francisco Yacht Club, the oldest club on the Pacific, was actually founded in 1869. Right now, that was water that was formed at a pier.
Right.
In those days, big bay there.
You go, I mean, all you have to do is walk in the financial district and walk over to the old B of A building, and you look down on Montgomery Street and you see the plaque that says this is where the bay used to be, and everything else from there to the bay is fill. And, for those of us who are Giants fans and have, share season tickets, that's on fill. So you can develop an awful lot around the bay. It just needs to make sure that you use the appropriate amount of fill, and most important, that you provide maximum feasible public access to the bay. So that's why the ballpark, I keep calling it Pac-Bell, but AT&T, has that magnificent port walk around the ballpark, behind right field and behind center field, heading toward, and that, which is very wide. And that's because BCDC required the Giants to make that very wide and accessible for everybody to be able to walk around it and see the bay.
So if somebody wanted to put a dock in front of their house, they would talk to you guys because you wouldn't let them.
Oh no, we let them all the time. I cannot tell you how many permits over the past 9 months, how many permits I have signed through DocuSign for, to upgrade or replace individual docks. Happens all the time. It's a pretty, look, for a regulatory agency, it's a pretty simple process. I'm the first to admit that it is not an easy process for people who are not used to working with the government, but we're pretty darn good at it and we're pretty quick at it.
And so a bigger question. So everybody takes for granted that we all should be against climate change. I am, you are, everybody else is. But I got a question for you. So there may be a few countries that actually benefit from sea level rise and climate change. I've been postulating for a while that actually Russia, Moscow is 800 miles from the shoreline and 350 feet above sea level. Moscow is. And of course, they wouldn't be really against those northern permafrost covered mineral deposits being more easy to exploit if they were warmer. And they could have
a way to move their ships.
That's right.
Over
they could have deep water ports up there in their northern coastline, where they're doing loads and loads and loads of work. In fact, they're militarizing their northern coastline.
Right.
And they could have the largest east-west swath of what could be farmland if they could just warm the climate by about 6 degrees. And that would, of course, turn Nebraska into like a desert. But we all wonder, gee, do you feel forces as the BCDC that actually support these negative effects of climate change? I'm postulating this sort of fantasy worry about Russia. But do you see entities as the BCDC executive director and say, I'm not sure they're against climate change? Or are all the people that you come in contact with in favor of no climate change?
Ron, it's a great question. I'm going to answer it this way. We're really lucky as BCDC in the Bay Area because every poll that we've seen basically says that 3/4 of the Bay Area public, and this includes voters and non-voters, believe that climate change is real and that rising sea level is either a very serious or somewhat serious issue. That allows us to have a lot of latitude with regard to how we actually approach things. Very different, for example, every March, except in a pandemic, I go to Washington, D.C. and sit down with the 31 other states' coastal zone managers. And we talk with NOAA, we talk among ourselves and so on about what's going on in coastal zone management. And candidly, the folks from the Gulf states, and the mid-Atlantic, they can't necessarily talk the way we talk. I think it's changing, and I think it's changing pretty drastically, pretty quickly.
You mean by public opinion, they can't be as candid because public opinion isn't as evolved, I'm going to use the word evolved, as it may be in the Bay Area?
And in addition to that, actually, a number of years ago, some of those managers were actually told you cannot use the word climate change. Now that's changing, and it's changing in great part, and I love this, not necessarily just because of the states, but because of the local governments. I mean, you take a look at South Florida and the 4 counties on the eastern coast of South Florida, you know, Broward, Miami-Dade, all those guys. They put together a joint program 5-10 years ago, and they're working like the Dickens in order to try to resolve this and become more resilient. And it doesn't matter what the state's doing. They get that, right? They really get that. And so you see that happening in an awful lot of places along the Gulf Coast and along the Mid-Atlantic, even though many of the governors there, you know, have been, and I think they're changing now, but have been very much, you know, the kind of folks who argue that we're not going to talk about climate change. So that's definitely changing.
So I like the model of public-private partnerships. The Presidio, as some know, is the only, I've heard, the only profitable park in the whole nationwide system. And it's a public-private partnership where a small percentage of the land is leased to private entities. And
it was required to be that under the law that transferred.
Correct. I remember Larry, I spent a bunch of time studying it early, you know, 20 years ago. And so the question I have is, how would you be supportive of people who, in a like-minded fashion, may want to do something like, let's say, oyster restoration for Richardson Bay? 150 years ago, Richardson Bay was a very rich oyster bed. And as we all know, oysters are filter feeders. So when you add oysters to a wetland area, you clean it because the oysters keep filtering the water. That's how they feed. How can you be supportive of private activity that might want to do a restoration project like that? How does the BCDC work with any kind of private entity which want to create a restoration project like that?
Well, we've done it in the past. We'll do it again. You know, one of the biggest restoration projects along the bay is Montezuma, which was created in the early 90s as privately. And Jim Levine, who's a dear friend, and
Montezuma Slough, you mean up in the Delta? Where is Montezuma? Where is it?
In Solano County, and just inside, you know, right around the Sassoon Marsh, which we also have jurisdiction over. And they just breached literally 2 months ago. They've been working for years to create a system which allows the bay to come on in, and within 24 hours, elk were there. The bird population massively increased, and I remember back in the early 90s when I worked for Pete Wilson in the Capitol as managing half his cabinet. I walked over to the resources agency, and Doug Wheeler, the resources secretary, looked at me and said, "I just got the strangest call from a guy named Jim Levine, who has purchased 800 acres and he wants to turn it into a wetland. How do we regulate that? It's not a local government. It's not a, you know," and I said, and we looked at each other and said, well, it'll be the same way we'd regulate anything. So it's actually certainly doable. And we work with the private industry all the time. If they want, for example, to change a Bay Plan amendment in order to do something, or local governments, if they want to change a Bay Plan, you know, they pay for it, and we work with them cooperatively to try to do stuff. So there is no reason to think that BCDC shouldn't work with the private sector the same way it's going to be working with local governments or nonprofit agencies.
Okay, so lots of energy a couple of years ago, a little quieter now on the Twin Tunnels initiative.
Yeah.
You remember that during the 70s, the first peripheral canal was created to divert water from the California Delta, around the Delta, through the Delta, in trenches down to Southern California.
It wasn't created, it was proposed. It wasn't created.
So talk to me about peripheral canals and now the Twin Tunnels.
So BCDC's jurisdiction doesn't go up that far.
I was worried you'd say that. Darn.
But there is a link, and let's make sure that people understand the link. When it rains in the Bay Area, it tends to snow a lot in the Sierras. When the snow melts, it goes into the rivers. It goes into the massive river organization that ends up in the Delta. And the water that isn't pumped to the south or isn't used by agriculture flows through the Delta into the Bay.
Through the Bay, exactly.
And because we're a big estuary. I mean, we're the biggest estuary west of the Mississippi, one of the biggest estuaries in the world. And so one of the things that we have done over the past couple of years and I will take a little bit of credit for this, is to become far more involved with the Delta Stewardship Council, which is a state agency like we are. They don't regulate, they only plan voluntarily, et cetera. And we're working with them because historically BCDC is very much, as a state agency, stayed out of the peripheral canal issue, stayed out of Delta issues. But if you take a look at a map of the Delta and the Bay and the whole system, there is a place a little bit east of where we are called X2. X2 is where the fresh water from the east starts mixing with the salt water from the west. And as climate change happens, that X2 is going to be moving.
Goes upriver, right?
Well, it'll also go down because you're going to have far larger storms more infrequently.
Okay.
It's going to pull a whole huge rush of water down. And so that whole X2 system is going to change somehow. I don't know how. So we're now starting over the past couple of years to work with the Delta Stewardship Council in a very nascent effort to actually start marrying, it's the wrong word, integrating policy processes so that what happens in the Delta that affects the Bay and what happens in the Bay that affects the Delta doesn't happen independent of each other like it's happened over the past, 170 years since the state of California became a state. And that's really important to do. So for example, I'm on a science committee, which people would laugh at if they knew me, but I'm on a science committee of the Delta Stewardship Council specifically so that we recognize that the Bay has an influence on the Delta and the Delta has an influence on the Bay.
Actually, I couldn't agree more. In fact, the worrisome issue about the peripheral canals is that could potentially affect net Delta outflow. Those who sail the Bay know that the ebbs are bigger than the floods because essentially water is coming down from the mountains, and after rainfall, we have bigger ebbs so that water is going out of the Bay. There's a term called net Delta outflow. How much water actually leaves the gate is greater than the amount of water that comes in as high tides come in. And one of the problems with diverting water away from the Delta is that it no longer would be flowing out through the Bay. And the Bay is cleaned twice a day by the ebb tides. They clean it. That's really, really important. The whole Bay would smell different if we peripherally bypass the Delta with water and send it somewhere else.
And now in 2021, add climate change on top of that. How will climate change affect the Delta, and how will science look at that and forecast that with regard to flows, with regard to species, and the like, and then how is that going to affect the Bay? Those are big questions, and that's what we're literally this past year starting to figure out, how do we deal with that? Because I showed the slide a little while ago of 7 regulatory agencies that work together around the Bay. Multiply that by 2 or 3, and you can figure out what you're going to have to deal with in the Delta and the Bay together.
So what are the other organizations if I look at a matrix of organizations that you collaborate with, give me sort of the top priority, top 3 or 4.
Well, certainly the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and NIMS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, which is part of NOAA, the Regional Water Quality Board, certainly, EPA, federal EPA. Those are some of the big ones in the Bay itself. But when you talk about the Bay plus the Delta, then you're including Bureau of Land Management. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service covers the whole thing. So does California Fish and Wildlife. You also have Bureau of Reclamation. You've got all sorts of different players because it's the Delta. You have the federal and state water projects, for heaven's sake. Department of Water Resources. We don't deal with Department of Water Resources very much around here, but if you're going to work in the Delta, you can't take a step without tripping over it. So, so you're talking about a massive group of different regulatory agencies that have different legislative authority that cover some of the different stuff and some of the same stuff. So how do you actually make that work in a cohesive whole?
So many of us who founded companies use weekly structured meetings as ways for departments to talk to each other, standard meetings. product dev meeting, marketing meetings, etc. So do you have regular weekly and or other perennial meetings that you have with these other organizations?
That's what we do. That's what the BRID is all about. It's not only regular meetings. Under that structure where those 7 people work together, in non-pandemic times, they're sitting together 2 or 3 days a week, literally sitting together, because that's the way you ensure that they're talking with each other and they're developing and they're actually developing an answer together, as opposed to picking, look, I'm 62 years old. I believe in picking up the phone. An awful lot of people who are younger than I am don't pick up the phone anymore. They just sit there and type. One of the things I tell my people is you have to talk with them. If you talk to somebody for 10 minutes, you're cutting out an hour or 2 hours worth of emails. And so that's why.
Can I just tape this section and send it to my children?
Hey, I got a junior in high school. I'm the same, I got the same thing, right? So the key here is to get them in the same room physically and getting them to work as a team. And the lovely thing is they really want to do it. I mean, they're really upset now in the pandemic because they can't sit together. But it actually has started to work. And the first couple of projects have actually come through us. And now more and more will come through us. And I think it's going to work. So it's getting people together physically that I think is really, really important. And it's something that the pandemic in an indirect way has demonstrated.
Well, Larry Goldzband, it has been a pleasure to have the executive director of BCDC, a guest of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon program. Thank you so much for coming and telling us about your very, very important organization. Those of us in the yachting community love the Bay and welcome the opportunity to hear from somebody else who loves it and can do a lot about helping us keep it beautiful, clean, and accessible. So thank you very much for being our guest on the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon program, Larry. And with
Thank you very much for having me.
And with that, the luncheon is adjourned. Thank you. Thank you for joining the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon, where we ask that you always stay curious.
This has been a presentation of the Wednesday Yachting Luncheon.